Older books, and some recent ones, emphasize the importance of the Middle East or Fertile Crescent, which stretched from the Mediterranean shore to the Anatolian Plateau and the alluvial plains of Iraq. All the bread-based civilizations derived their staples from this area, which gave us wheat, barley, sheep, and goats. But it's now clear that the Middle East was only one of at least 4 major regions of the world where agriculture developed independently at about the same time. The others are the Far East, where rice and millet became the main staples, Mesoamerica, which means Mexico and neighboring parts of Central America, whose civilizations were based on maize, beans, squashes, amaranth, and tomatoes, and the Andean region of South America, which developed many kinds of potato, other tubers, squash, cotton, peanuts, and high-protein grains such as quinoa. In all these heartlands, crop domestication appears between 8 and 10,000 years ago. Besides these big 4, there are also about a dozen lesser founding areas around the world. Unconnected peoples sometimes develop the same plants. Cotton and peanuts are each of 2 kinds, developed simultaneously in the New World and the Old. Animal domestication is harder to document, but at about the same time people were developing crops, they learned that certain herbivores and birds could be followed, corralled, and killed at a sustainable rate. Over generations, these animals grew tame enough and dim-witted enough not to mind the 2-legged serial killer who followed them around. Hunting became herding, just as gathering grew into gardening. Sheep and goats were the first true domesticates in the Middle East, starting about 8000 BC. Domestic camelids, early forms of the llama and alpaca, used for pack trains and wool as well as meat, appear in Peru during the 6th millennium BC, about the same time as cattle in Eurasia, though neither camelids nor early cattle were milked. Donkeys and horses were tamed by about 4000 BC. Craftier creatures such as dogs, pigs, and cats had long been willing to hang around human settlements in return for scraps, slops, and the mouse boom spurred by granaries. Dogs, which may have been tamed for hunting back in the Paleolithic, are found with human groups throughout the world. In cold weather, they were sometimes used as bed warmers, which some experts believe accounts for the expression three-dog night. Actually, that's not a joke, it's true. In places such as Korea and Mexico, special breeds were kept for meat. The chicken began its sad march towards the maw of Colonel Sanders as a gorgeously feathered Asian jungle fowl, while Mexico developed the turkey. Along with the llama and alpaca, Peruvians kept Muscovy ducks and the lowly but prolific guinea pig, which even made a cameo appearance on the menu of Christ's Last Supper in a colonial Peruvian painting. As the eating of guinea pigs and chihuahuas suggests, the Americas were less well endowed with domesticable animals than the Old World. But the New World compensated by developing a wider and more productive range of plants. Peru alone had nearly 40 major species. Such plants eventually supported huge native cities in the Americas, and several of them would transform the Old World's nutrition and economics when they were introduced there, a matter I shall discuss in the final lecture. The more predictable the food supply, the bigger the population. Unlike mobile foragers, sedentary people had little reason to limit the number of children who were useful for field and household tasks. The reproductive rate of women tended to rise, owing to higher levels of body fat and earlier weaning with animal milk and cereal baby food. Farmers soon outnumbered hunter-gatherers, absorbing, killing, or driving them into the surrounding wilderness. At the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, when our modern subspecies emerged by fair means or foul as the Earth's inheritors, we numbered perhaps 1/3 all told. By 10,000 years ago, on the eve of agriculture, and after settling all habitable continents, we'd increased to about 3 million. And by 5,000 years ago, when farming was established in all the founding regions, and full civilization had already begun in Sumer and Egypt, we may have reached between 50 and 20 million people worldwide. Such figures are merely educated guesswork, and everything else I've just said is, of course, an oversimplification. The change to full-time farming took millennia, and early results were not always promising, even in a core zone such as the Middle East. Neolithic Jericho was tiny, a mere 4 acres in 8000 BC, and took another 1,500 years to reach 10 acres. The Turkish site of Çatalhöyük, the largest settlement in the Fertile Crescent between 7000 and 5500 BC, covered only 1/20th of a square mile, or 32 acres, and its inhabitants depended on wild game for much of their protein. As any rural Canadian knows, hunting continues among farmers wherever it's fun or worthwhile. And this was especially true in the Americas and parts of Asia where domestic animals were scarce. Nevertheless, the pace of growth accelerated. By about 5,000 years ago, the majority of human beings had made the transition from wild food to tame. In the magnitude of its consequences, no other invention rivals farming, except, since 1940, the invention of weapons that can kill us all. The human career divides in two: everything before the Neolithic Revolution and everything after it. Although the 3 Stone Ages, Old, Middle, and New, may seem to belong in a set, they don't. The New Stone Age has much more in common with later ages than with the millions of years of stone toolery that went before it. The farming revolution produced an entirely new mode of subsistence, which remains the basis of the world economy to this day. The food technology of the late Stone Age is the one technology we cannot live without. The crops of about a dozen ancient peoples feed the 6 billion on Earth today. Despite more than 2 centuries of scientific crop breeding, despite the so-called Green Revolution of the 1960s and the genetic engineering of the 1990s, not one new staple has been added to our repertoire of crops since prehistoric times. Although the New Stone Age eventually gave way to metalworking in several parts of the world and to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, these were elaborations on the same theme, not a fundamental shift in subsistence. A Neolithic village was much like a Bronze Age or an Iron Age village, or a modern Third World village for that matter. The Victorian archaeological scheme of classifying stages of human development by tool materials becomes unhelpful from the Neolithic onward. It may have some merit in Europe, where technology was often linked to social change, but is little help for understanding what happened in places where a lack of the things our technocentric culture regards as basic, metal, plows, wheels, etc., was ingeniously circumvented, or where, conversely, their presence was inconsequential. For example, Mesopotamia invented the wheel about 4000 BC, but its close neighbor Egypt made no use of wheels for another 2,000 years. The classic period Maya, a literate civilization rivaling classical Europe in mathematics and astronomy, made so little use of metals that they were technically in the Stone Age. By contrast, sub-Saharan Africa mastered ironworking by 500 BC, as early as China did, yet never developed a full-blown civilization. The Incas of Peru, where metalworking had begun about 1500 BC, created one of the world's largest and most closely administered empires, yet may have done so without writing as we know it, though the evidence is growing that their quipu system was indeed a form of script. Japan made pottery long before anyone else, more than 12,000 years ago, but rice farming and full civilization did not appear there for another 10,000 years, adopted wholesale from China and Korea. The Japanese didn't begin to work bronze until 500 BC, but became famous for steel swords by the 16th century. At that time, they acquired European firearms, then abandoned them for 300 years. We should therefore be wary of technological determinism, for it tends to underestimate cultural factors and reduce complex questions of human adaptation to a simplistic, we're the winners of history, so why didn't others do what we did? We call agriculture and civilization inventions or experiments because that is how they look to hindsight. But they began accidentally, a series of seductive steps down a path leading, for most people, to lives of monotony and toil. Farming achieved quantity at the expense of quality. More food and more people, but seldom better nourishment or better lives. People gave up a broad array of wild foods for a handful of starchy roots and grasses. As we domesticated these plants, the plants domesticated us. Without us, they die, and without them, so do we. There is no escape from agriculture except into mass starvation, and it is often led there anyway with drought and blight. Most people, throughout most of time, have lived on the edge of hunger, and much of the world still does.
I'm Paul Kennedy, and this is Ideas. From the Meyer Horowitz Theater at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, you're listening to The Great Experiment, the second of Ronald Wright's 2004 Massey Lectures, A Short History of Progress.
In hunter-gatherer societies, barring a few special cases, the social structure was more or less egalitarian, with only slight differences in wealth and power between the greatest and the least. Leadership was either diffuse, a matter of consensus, or something earned by merit and example. The successful hunter did not sit down beside his kill and stuff himself on the spot. He shared the meat and thereby gained prestige. If a leader became overbearing or a minority disliked a majority decision, people could leave. In an uncrowded world without fixed borders or belongings, it was easy to vote with one's feet. The early towns and villages that sprang up in a dozen farming heartlands around the world after the last ice age seem to have continued these free and easy ways for a while. Most of them were small peasant communities in which everyone worked at similar tasks and had a comparable standard of living. Land was either communally owned or thought of as having no owner but the gods. Farmers whose effort and skill made them wealthier had an obligation to share with the needy, to whom they were bound by kinship. Gradually, however, differences in wealth and power became entrenched. Freedom and social opportunity declined as populations rose and boundaries hardened between groups. This pattern first appears in the Neolithic villages of the Middle East, and it has recurred all over the world. The first farmers along the Danube, for example, left only tools in their remains. But their later settlements are heavily fortified and strewn with weapons. Here, said the great Australian archaeologist Gordon Childe, we almost see the state of war of all, against all, arising as land became scarce. Writing those words in 1942, during Hitler's expansionist policy of Lebensraum, Childe did not need to underline how little the world had changed from Stone Age times to his.